I started with a question this morning, and I'm going to start with a question, a slightly different question again tonight. If Jesus could use questions to help his listeners think through things, then it's a good thing for us to do, isn't it? So our question tonight is, what guarantees our future? What guarantees our future? And we thought a bit about this last week with the name The Rock. But what is it that we base our hopes in that allows us to face the future without fear? Because the world is frightening, and we can see the way things are going in international politics and the economy and with society, and it is frightening. And without something concrete, without something solid to ground our uncertainties, we could drown in anxiety. Yahweh Jireh, or Jehovah Jireh, is a name that many of us have probably heard before, or we've sung it in hymns. It means the Lord will provide. And as I said, it's taken right out of this passage here. It's a wonderful name, but as we look at it in context, I hope we'll all see that it is a much bigger, richer and deeper name than maybe we've realized. So my first point tonight is that God gives us what we need. God gives us what we need. I'm not trying to pull a fast one on you here. The Lord will provide is a straightforward name. It's not like a name that means the complete opposite of what you think it means. It means what it sounds like. The Lord will provide. He gives us what we need. And then don't we hear those words as Abraham says to Isaac in verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. They need a lamb for an offering. Abraham says God will provide one. The voice of faith says God gives us what we need. God is the creator, after all. He's the one who formed all things, and he sustains all things. So he's not like a watchmaker who just kind of set the clock ticking and then left it. He's actively involved in his creation. He provides for. Psalm 104 says, he makes springs pour water into the ravines. It flows between the mountains. They give water to all the beasts of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. The birds of the sky nest by the waters. They sing among the branches. He waters the mountains from his upper chambers. The land is satisfied by the fruit of his work. He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for people to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens human hearts, oil to make their faces shine, and bread that sustains their hearts. God gives us what we need, and he gives us more than just what we need, doesn't he? Not just a bare sustenance, but wine that gladdens human hearts, oil to make their faces shine. It's what we call common grace, which is one of these funny theological sayings that kind of cheapens something mysterious. It's common, it sounds common. That just means it's a gift of God that is common to all. It's not common, is it? It's amazing, it's wonderful, it's gracious, but it's common to all. God gives it to all. Food and water, the law of gravity, everything that sustains this little planet of ours in the perfect spot for life to flourish. Nature is rich and beautiful and abundant, and God gives all of us, man and beast. And we just walked through the park earlier and saw the mess that the jackdaws or the rooks are making, because they're making their nests. You know, all these crows that live around here, how do they get fed? God feeds them. He provides food for the birds. He provides food for the sparrows. And are we not more precious than many sparrows? Everything we can eat and drink and enjoy is a gift from a generous God. Jehovah Jireh provides. This is one reason it's so serious when people don't acknowledge God as God. That's right, isn't it? It's just ingratitude on a cosmic scale. God gives and gives and gives. Every breath they take is a gift. Every meal we eat, every time we're not freezing to death in our homes, it's a gift of God. And yet people still refuse to admit that he even exists. Yahweh Jireh gives everyone what they need. But what is true for all creation, the jackdaws and the rooks in the park and the sparrows and just everyone, isn't that especially true for God's chosen people? God has a special relationship with his chosen people that he doesn't have with everyone else. God remembers his people. They are the apple of his eye. He lavishes particular attention on them and provides for them in particular ways. Just think of Israel as God brought them out of Egypt to be his people. Psalm 78 says this: he did miracles in the sight of their ancestors in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan. He divided the sea and led them through. He made the water stand up like a wall. He guided them with a cloud by day and with light from the fire at night. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of a rocky crag and made water flow down like rivers. God gives creation what she needs through the natural world, but he also gives his people what they need through the miraculous power of his mighty arm. Through the finger of God, God provides for his people. If you stand in a covenant relationship with the living God, you should expect him to provide in wonderful and miraculous ways. We're often too sort of set in the ways of the world to expect it. And we think, how are you going to pay those bills? How are you going to afford that car you need to get to work? How can you put enough food on the table or keep a roof over your head? How are you going to do it? The Lord will provide. Our dad is a king and he's got big pockets. Now, it's never an excuse for laziness. We all know that here tonight. As the Apostle Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, within the Christian community, within the church, the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. He's not saying, join the church and mooch. We should pull our own weight. But God cares for his children. And he shows that care through miraculous provision, whether it's by money appearing through the letterbox, as if from nowhere at just the right time, or else through the loving care of his people. And I've experienced that. I've experienced within this church, need to buy a car, you gave me the money. Needed to buy a house, you gave me money to buy it. God provided for me through you. Now sometimes, because you're probably wondering, what about when people go hungry? What about people who don't have? God seems to not be giving them what they need. Well, certainly sometimes God allows some of his people to go hungry so that some of his people elsewhere will be encouraged to open their pockets. We've got a big family. It's not a family where anyone should go hungry because we have enough to share. Now, when everything we have is a gift, when the money we earn is a gift of God, the fact we have jobs, the fact we have an income is a gift of God, when we've received it as a gift, shouldn't it make it that much easier to share? It does, doesn't it? It's not like, I've earned this is mine. It's, God's let this come into my hand. How can I bless my brothers and sisters as you've blessed me and so many others? God gives us what we need. And we shouldn't demand that God provide what we don't need and what isn't good for us and I'll restrain myself and not go hopping mad about the prosperity gospel or the lies that it tells to people that everything they want, everything they could possibly desire, they would have if only they sort of paid in enough, if only they prayed hard enough, if only they had faith. And, people yearning after all these worldly things that aren't good for us. God isn't going to give us those things. You should almost be worried if you start getting those things. You're like, well, how can I afford this when I should be providing for others? But God is a caring God. We can trust him to provide what we need when we know that we belong to him. And when we don't have, and when we need, we should ask God, because he will provide. Like James says, you don't have because you don't ask. Or you ask with wrong motives. You're asking for a fancy new car. Or you're asking for something you don't need. God says, ask what you need, and I will give it to you. But we've not really dug into our passage yet. I think I've quoted one verse from it. So my second point is this. God will give us what we need. And you're trying to work out the difference of those 2 points, aren't you? I'm essentially just repeating my first point. God gives us what we need, and God will give us what we need. Because if that first point is about understanding about how God provides for us in the present, well, let's think again about that question. What guarantees our future? Because that's exactly the situation Abraham is in chapter 22 of Genesis. The whole course of his journey from chapter 12 has been God promising great things about the future. That's like how he's called. I'll make a great nation of you. The nations of the world will be blessed through you. It's all this future blessing. And this future blessing is so much bigger than just you're going to have a big family, Abraham. It's essentially promising the undoing of the curse and the slavery that all nations are subject to from earlier in the book of Genesis. This isn't just a promise to look after Abraham in the present, but to bring unbelievable blessing to those who descend from him, the innumerable children, like the stars in the sky, that he will have. So let's talk for a moment about child sacrifice. And there are a few things more repugnant in the modern world. The reality of abortion, where we as a society sacrifice unborn human children for the sake of our lifestyle and our pursuit of comfort and pleasure, has made child sacrifice the most common cause of death worldwide. But however much of a hypocrisy it is, the idea of sacrificing your child to a god in order to earn their favour is appalling to most modern people, isn't it? They wouldn't think twice about abortion, but this story in Genesis is very distasteful. When they seem to come across the idea of child sacrifice in Genesis, they want to stop reading, if they even made it this far. They want to abandon the whole pursuit of a god who would seemingly condone or even, as here, demand such an action. And it's what God says, isn't it? He says, go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice your son there as a burnt offering. So he does command it. But there is a reason that for literally thousands of years, Jewish people have taught this story with the moral that we don't sacrifice our children. Yeah, because Jewish people aren't going to see Jesus in this story, are they? But that's not to say that this story has no moral. For them, the moral is very clearly, we do not sacrifice our children. Other people might do it, we don't sacrifice our children. Isn't that interesting when that's the very thing God seems to ask Abraham to do? But the fact that we do not sacrifice our children is a lesson God is teaching here. In the ancient Near East, I like talking about the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, you made sacrifices to provide for the needs of the gods. So you'd kill an animal, or you put the bit of bread or some flour, or you'd burn something as an offering to the god. And it was seen that they sort of directly benefited from that. That the gods needed food, so you'd burn some food and then it would get to the gods. Or, they need a steak and you give them some meat and they would enjoy that. And that was, you were sort of serving the needs of the gods. And in wider religions, they'd have ceremonies where you'd dress the god in the morning and then you put them to bed at night. As a sort of, you were seeing to the needs of the gods so that they would see to your needs. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It was a kind of symbiotic relationship. If the worshippers looked after the gods would look after their worshippers. Generous gifts would guarantee generous treatment. And there was nothing more generous you could give to the god than your child. Especially a male child, because he was your heir. He was like the most valuable of your children because he'd inherit it all. He was the one who would be head of the family. He was the one who would take care of you in your old age. He would have that responsibility. He would have the responsibility of attending to the proper burial rites that guaranteed your place in the afterlife. Child sacrifice, it wasn't maybe that common throughout different countries in the ancient Near East, but it was known. It was a sort of a really special thing that you could do for a god. So that's why Abraham doesn't seem to bat an eyelid when God asks him to sacrifice Isaac. Now, this whole narrative, like I was saying before, is so well written, it's so deliberately emotionally charged. It is traumatic to read, and it's meant to be. That unnecessary repetition. His son, Isaac. His father, Abraham. Yes, son. Yes, father. It's remind you again and again how horrible this situation is for Abraham. So make no bones about that. But Abraham doesn't think that it's unusual for a God to ask for a human sacrifice in order to guarantee a favourable future. It's just normal, that idea that you sacrifice a child, well, that guarantees the future, doesn't it? I sacrifice my child, therefore God will have to come through in a big way for me. And so though it breaks his heart, he'll do it. Now we know from the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, that Abraham trusts God so thoroughly that he expects God to raise Isaac from the dead if that is what it takes to keep his word. Because God has said, through Isaac, the promise will come. That can't happen if Isaac's dead. So when God says, kill Isaac, he thinks, okay, this is horrible, but God's going to bring Isaac back from the dead. Because through Isaac, my descendants will come. Abraham knows that. Well, to cut a long story short, after we see the extent of Abraham's obedience, he reaches out his hand for the knife, and God intervenes to stop the sacrifice. We see in the name that Abraham gives that place just what God has taught him. The Lord will provide. Because, at least from Abraham's perspective, there was a big question mark over the promises God had made about the future. Because, unlike God, Abraham doesn't know what's going to happen in the future. None of us do we? We don't know what might happen in the future. So when God says this is going to happen, we wonder, yeah, but will it? He said it will happen, but I don't know that it will, do I? But Abraham learned that God will give us what we need. He will provide the lamb for the sacrifice. He, therefore, will guarantee the promised future of blessing. Abraham doesn't need to sacrifice his son. That's what Jewish people rightly get from this story. We don't sacrifice our children. We don't need to. God doesn't have needs that we need to satisfy in order for him to bless us. He will see to it. Our future is secure because he's the one who will give it. God will fix it. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. God swears by himself because there is no one and nothing higher by which he can swear. And he says he will do it. Several times in Abraham's life, God makes very clear, it's not what you do, Abraham. Which is helpful because he says, because you've done this. So it seems to be in response to Abraham's works. But several times throughout the story of Abraham, God makes clear, I will do it. I guarantee the covenant. I guarantee the blessing. Our part is not to work. It's not to sacrifice, though a faithful believer will do both of those things in the course of their life. Our part is to believe and receive what God provides. So what guarantees our future? Yahweh Jireh. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. God gives us what we need. We can trust God, can't we, with our today? Because he's generous and he cares for us. God will give us what we need. We can trust God with our tomorrow. Because he's proven time and time again that our futures are secure when they're in his hands. We are promised blessing ahead, whatever we're going through now, because of a lamb that was sacrificed in our place. The ram whose head was trapped in the thicket, the head crowned with thorns. He took our place to secure God's blessing. What guarantees our future? Not what these hands have done, but what God has done in Christ, the Lord who sent Jesus. If he would accept the sacrifice of a ram in Isaac's place, how much more can we trust that we are bought at such a price that it is more than enough to make up for any of our mistakes? It is more than enough to secure a future of blessing that we could never imagine. The Lord who provides. Will you bring your worries, your doubts and your fears, which we all have, to Jesus tonight? Let's sing our final hymn. 258, Great is thy faithfulness.